Good to go.
Just a second. Well, thank you for having me and coming back. As I explained last time, I'm, not an expert on Mipham, but I sort of assigned myself and was graciously allowed by Shantideva to talk about Ju Mipham, one of the greatest scholars and teachers of Tibetan Buddhism, who's the most prominent member of the Nyingma school, which is in many ways very different, right, from Tsongkhapa's Gelugpa school. I don't know if you know much about me, but like almost everything that I've published is either a translation of something from within the Gelugpa tradition or an explanation of something from within the Gelugpa tradition. And there's only maybe one exception in my whole career to that. So yeah, I've been mainly inspired, or I would say intellectually enlightened by Tsongkhapa's thought, Tsongkhapa Losang Chakpa 1357 to 1419, whom I consider a great genius. And but I was arguing last time that great geniuses of Tibetan Buddhism aren't limited to the Gelugpa tradition. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said that there are enlightened beings in all four major orders of Tibetan Buddhism. And so he has these various ways of reading or interpreting or reconstructing the teachings of these other traditions as being different ways of saying the same thing that Tsongkhapa is getting at, which is, generally speaking, not at all what those people say about themselves. So it's a kind of, interpretive inclusivism or charity, in reading from His Holiness. My model, rather than that, is, as I explained last time, to use the root metaphor that as Buddhists, we go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And we taking refuge in the Buddha is taking refuge in relying on a doctor, and relying on the Dharma is like relying upon the course of therapy or the medicine that's prescribed by the doctor. Okay, and the crucial thing about a doctor, a qualified physician, a skilled physician, is that they don't give the same remedy to each person. They never say, this will cure acne and cancer and cirrhosis of the liver. And the people who say that are called quacks, right? And so Dr. Buddha is not a quack, and therefore has many different remedies. And like, if you think about it, some of these remedies, if you think about it on the model of a physician, which is the tradition invites us to think of it, some of these medicines have exactly the opposite effect of others, right? Easy to understand is the difference between constipation and diarrhea. A medicine, that for one, if you give the wrong medicine, right, it will actually make the person worse, right? So on that model, this is how I think in a big picture way about the differences within the Buddhist tradition. And many other Buddhists do think this way too. And I think it's one of the reasons that for the most part, there's been mutual tolerance, not always, right? We know that, but for the most part, as compared to some other traditions, there's been relative mutual tolerance of different approaches within the Buddhist tradition. So we're learning about Mipham from the book Jamgon Mipham, His Life and Teaching by Douglas Duckworth. Douglas Duckworth is at Temple University. He's a good scholar, very good scholar and translator, and he's a specialist in Mipham. And he's written a number of books and articles now about Mipham, and this one is by far the most accessible. It's intended for a general audience, which doesn't mean that it's going to be in the dentist's waiting room. It means that it's for us. It means it's for people who know and are curious to learn more about Buddhism and have some degree of background, right, to build upon. And last time we kind of introduced from the first part of the book who Mipham was and why it might be important. And then there's a couple more chapters in the first part of the book where he gives you a very concise history of Buddhist philosophy in India, the major figures and their ideas, and then a history of Buddhism in Tibet, the major periods and the thinkers and the development over the centuries, from Shantarekshota and Padmasambhava down to the time of Mipham, who, as we mentioned last time, lived into the early 20th century. So we're not going to go over that. I invite you to get this book and read over that part. But it's just, I don't have enough classes, right? There's just this class and one more to cover that as well. One of the constructs in Mahayana Buddhism that comes from the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra, very famous Mahayana Sutra, is the idea of three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. There's a classification of all Buddhist sutras into these three categories. And roughly speaking, the first turning of the wheel being the Pali Canon and related material, in which we're taught about the Four Noble Truths and so forth. And the second turning of the wheel being the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and related texts, which expound emptiness as the ultimate nature of all phenomena and the relationship between emptiness and compassion and emptiness and the Bodhisattva path. And the third turning of the wheel expounds mind as the mind basis of all. We can say that when we think about it, we can't actually, we don't know anything outside our mind. All the appearances that we take as being external are all, maybe we would say electrical impulses or neurons, firing within our brain, which are generating these consciousnesses, and we can't directly contact anything outside our consciousness. So, the mind, the sutras of the mind-only school focus on mind as a fundamental reality that is at the basis of things and from which all appearances rise, right? And this is where you get the Yogacara and the Chittamatra philosophies, emerging out of that. And also within the third turning of the wheel, you have usually it's counted as not as a separate turning, but as the later part of the third turning is a set of sutras which focus on the idea of Buddha nature, a primordial purity of mind that's has always existed and exists within us right now, and is waiting to be uncovered or manifest. And there are so rather than, and this is a basic idea, right? Rather than thinking about we're not Buddhas, but we have the capacity to someday be Buddhas, and that capacity is our Buddha nature, our intrinsic Buddha potential. In the Buddha nature sutras, and also in some shastras, you get a presentation of us as, in a fundamental primordial sense, already being fully enlightened. And the reason we don't know that is because, our fundamental purity and goodness has been covered over by delusion. So instead of thinking about, we have to create Buddhahood by accumulating causes and conditions, a gradual process of accumulating, right? And then the other way is to think about it in terms of, we already at the deepest level have everything we need, but we just have to let it shine. How are we going to do that? Well, that's the path. Path is, letting our fundamental Buddha nature emerge. One time I was, when I published a book, I was invited to visit wisdom publications in a place outside of Boston. And I went out, they took me out to lunch and did some other things. And over lunch, we were having this Buddhist, philosophical discussion. And there was a little bit of disagreement over the idea of whether the fundamental nature of things is that they are empty of any essential nature, whether that essential nature be good or bad, or rather whether the fundamental nature of things is intrinsic goodness. So it didn't turn into a big argument, but just there at that table, there were some people who thought that the truth of Buddhism is that we're all basically fundamentally truly good because we're intrinsically Buddhas, right? And we just haven't manifested that Buddha nature. And that would be people who are, taking the medicine, if we could say, from this latter part of the third turning of the wheel, right? And then there's other people who are more in line with the way I usually talk and the way Tsongkhapa usually talks, right? Which is that we have the potential to become Buddhas, but we're not Buddhas. And we have to gradually accumulate cause and conditions to create a transformation. So this is like the two sides of the Buddhist world. And it's not, if you think about like what we're used to and the people we talk to, we mostly the idea that we're truly actually already Buddhas with all the qualities of a Buddha seems quite strange. But in fact, this kind of idea is quite pervasive in the Tibetan Buddhist world and also in East Asia as well. So when you think about in East Asia, the distinction between sudden enlightenment and gradual enlightenment, this is the same kind of dispute. Are we basically Buddhas and we just have to allow that to manifest, or do we have to gradually polish our minds and purify them? So that's the context, I think, for this. Tsongkhapa is a gradualist, and he and Mipham is part of a Subbatist being a fancy word for people who believe that we're fundamentally already enlightened, or sudden enlightenment people. When you say sudden enlightenment, you mean fundamentally we already are enlightened, we just don't know it. And so the Nyingma tradition is decidedly on that side, and that we're fundamentally Buddhas. And there are many other Buddhists who are as well. There are many Kagyapas, for example, who say exactly the same thing. And so these are the two, I would say, if like these are two major medicines in the Dharma pharmacy. I'm trying to say these are both part of the legitimate literature of the Buddhist tradition. They both have a legitimate place within the Buddhist teachings. They're Dharma. They're in the Dharma pharmacy. Yeah. And yeah. So it's Tsongkhapa had a particular role of rationalizing, of taking the tradition that comes from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, and trying to the greatest extent possible, resolve all the paradoxes and explain in a way that's clear and coherent and rational and sensible. My paper on Tsongkhapa's philosophy that's coming out in a book this fall commemorating the 600th anniversary of his parinirvana is called Start Making Sense. So the idea is that, that sometimes, like in the Dharma pharmacy, sometimes giving paradoxes or contradictions is a good medicine for some people. It's a way of expressing reality sometimes, or maybe silence is sometimes the best way to teach. But then maybe some people, some other time, would like a clear explanation. And of course, a clear explanation is never going to be a perfect representation of a sublime, inexpressible Dharma either, right? But it could be help the right medicine for some of us, such as myself, right? For example. Anyway, so in the chapters we're skipping over, he gives this summary of how in the 8th century, Shanti-Rakshita was invited to Tibet to start Buddhism, and Padmasambhava was invited maybe a little bit later. And then, so the Nyingma tradition, which means the old school, right, was the school of Buddhism at that time until 838, when King Longdharma converted from Buddhism to Burma and persecuted Buddhism. And then you have this period from the 9th through the 10th centuries when it's sort of the dark period. Duckworth in his book argues that maybe a lot of really positive, important things for Buddhism transpired during this period, but we don't really know exactly what these were. And Buddhism emerges, again, in a sort of second transmission in the 11th century with Atisha coming to Tibet. So all of the really big, important developments then in the kinds of Buddhism that aren't the old school, right, happened between the 11th century arrival of Atisha and the 15th century, when you have Tsongkhapa and Karamba and in the Kagyapa tradition. So, also in the 14th century, as part of that flourishing of new kinds of Dharma, there was Dolpapa. And Dolpapa was a proponent of other emptiness. So his way, he read sutras and tantras copiously, had vast learning, and he believed that you could use any part of Buddha's word as a key or commentary to understanding any part of Buddha's word. So he would read, the Perfection of Wisdom sutras in light of tantric texts, and that these are all in different ways explaining the same thing. And what is the thing they're explaining? They're explaining that fundamentally, the truth, or the only reality, is that we are all perfectly enlightened Buddhas, and that we have all the marks and powers and capacities of a Buddha right now, right? And that that one true reality of Samantabhadra, or perfectly good Buddha, is empty of all of this delusory stuff that is appearing to us right now. That's called other emptiness. So the things that we see, like this table here in front of me, it is empty of inherent existence, but that's not very important for Dolpapa's system. It's a trivial thing. It's like saying, an illusion is empty, a table is empty, is sort of the same thing. None of these things is real. What's real is Buddhahood, right? That we perfectly and clearly have right now, and we have to wake up to. So, Tsongkhapa's teacher, Rendawa, who was a Sakyapa, didn't like this, and Tsongkhapa, didn't like it either. And they were, Tsongkhapa studied very hard and meditated very hard and developed his own clear explanation, which was then in the next generation criticized by Karamba. So those are the kind of important landmarks in this 11th to 14th century development of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. Duckworth actually makes the argument, and I'm sure there were other scholars who would disagree, that like after that, not really that much happens until the 19th century. So it's not that there isn't Buddhism, the Buddhism is flourishing, but it's like philosophically, there isn't any, major new developments on the horizon until the 19th century. And then you have this development in Eastern Tibet of the non-sectarian schools, where basically, as a counterbalance to the great power that the Gelugpa tradition had, and Gelugpa's, frankly, persecution of some of the other schools, including all the ones that were in the lineage of Dolbapa. As a counterbalance to that, these schools of Sakya, Nyingma, and Kagyapa in eastern Tibet sort of, you could say that they loosely formed an alliance in the sense that they all started reading each other's work and engaging with each other intellectually, recognizing their commonalities and distinguishing themselves from the Gelugpa tradition. So Mipham was part of that. And so he was a person who was a major critic of Tsongkhapa in a lot of ways. And that's why maybe another Dharma center that with which I'm friends did not accept this as a topic for me to talk about, because he's a very powerful critic of Tsongkhapa. And he had, as I mentioned last time, he has a huge advantage over Tsongkhapa, and that is that he lives 500 years later, and Tsongkhapa's work is preserved, and he can read it all. And in my estimation, he understands it. In other words, he can read and understand what Tsongkhapa is doing, and then say why he thinks his thing is better, to which Tsongkhapa himself cannot reply, right? So it has to be somebody representing the Gelugpa tradition, trying to generate a refutation. Yeah. Which I think, if I remember correctly, Geshe Tupke was working on some such thing. Anyway, what I wanted to talk more about today was this evening is Mipham's actual view. And, it's a view that integrates sutra sources and Buddhist philosophy from the Chittamatra, Yogacara, Madhyamaka schools, and integrates that with Tantra, in which the highest form of Tantra is taken to be Dzogchen, or the great perfection. And as he integrates these things, well, I mean, it's worth mentioning in way of contrast that Tsongkhapa does the opposite of Dolpapa and keeps these two things distinct from one another. About 2/3 of Tsongkhapa's total work deals with secret mantra, tantric materials, and but in those texts he doesn't quote sutras. And in, for example, the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, Lamrim Shemo, and his other, his 4 other major works on sutra-based Madhyamaka philosophy, he never quotes tantras, and he barely mentions tantra at all. And so he keeps these things distinct, and then he explains in his tantric texts how he sees the view of emptiness as that's explained in his works on Madhyamaka philosophy. He sees that view as the same emptiness, the same view that you're meditating on and realizing and using as part of your tantric practice. Okay. But not everybody agrees with that. Of course, Dolpa doesn't agree with it in the Jonang school, but also Mipham doesn't agree with it. And many non-Gelugpas don't agree. And Mipham in particular argues that Tantra, and particularly the Great Perfection, which he takes as the highest form of Tantra, has a different and higher view that integrates but goes beyond the kind of emptiness that we learn about from Nagarjuna and Tsongkhapa's explanations of Nagarjuna. So he's integrating Sutra and Tantra in a way that takes Tantra as distinct from Sutra, but ultimately advocating a superior philosophy. And a big emphasis in Duckworth's book is that Mipham integrated reason and the study and reason with practice and meditation. Douglas Duckworth explains, this juxtaposition quite a lot. Gelugpa is seen as the scholastic school, that everything is rationalized and intellectualized, and There's a lot of book learning going on. And this is, you know, this is in the tradition of the Kadambas who go back to Atisha. There's one of the great Kadamba teachers in the first or second generation after Atisha famously said that it doesn't matter whether you brag about having only read one book, or if you're ashamed about having read only one book. You'll never become a Buddha until you read a yak load of books. So, you know, the implication is that you have to actually understand the Dharma at an intellectual and conceptual level, and then meditate on and, you know, stabilize your mind on the meanings that you have understand conceptually and intellectually. Tsongkhapa is on about this over and over again, and very convincingly, to me, makes the point that that is the best teaching of the Indian tradition. But many other schools of Buddhism in Tibet, you know, think that the Gelugpas are too much engaged with conceptuality. The Buddha doesn't have concepts. The Buddha doesn't intellectualize things. And the Buddha spontaneously acts and with perfect compassion. And they see that as our innate capacity, right? So if you say, oh, let's start thinking about a lot of Dharma things, many people, including most Nyingmas, will say, well, you're totally heading in the wrong direction. In the great treatise, Tsongkhapa quotes another teacher without saying who the teacher is, who says that that this thing of, you know, doing intellectual analysis and then withdrawing from it is like, you know, throwing a ball for a dog and then having the dog bring the ball back. And what their view is, instead, you should just hold on to the ball. The ball being is like, yeah, we're perfect right now, just as we are. We don't have to, you know, leave ourselves and venture out in the realm of conceptuality and then retreat from it, according to these other traditions, right? Yeah, so a lot of Nyingmas would say that, and a lot of Kagyapas would say that too. But it turns out that even though they say this, they still end up studying philosophy, right? But it's downplayed, and it's made clear that it's definitely second to meditative practice, whatever that is. And in the Nyingma tradition, again, the highest type of meditative practice is this Dzogchen tradition. Now, when I learned about Tantra from reading, you know, Tsongkhapa and some interpretations of Tsongkhapa, he argues that what Tantra is the core of Tantra that's common to all Tantras is deity yoga. And he has quotes from sutras that suggest that that's the case. One says, the practice is taking the form of the teacher. In other words, that visualizing yourself as the awakened Buddha that you aspire to become is the distinctive practice of Tantra. Okay, so that it kind of came as a surprise to me when I started talking to more, you know, Americans who are practicing different, and also Nepalese friend who practice, you know, different forms of Tibetan Buddhism. They weren't really doing deity yoga in any sense that I understood. It's not that they are aware of deity yoga in tantric texts, but they want to practice the great perfection. And this doesn't involve necessarily visualizing any particular deity or imagining yourself as the deity, because you are the deity. You don't have to gradually assimilate yourself, right? You have to stop interfering with the natural process of manifesting who you fundamentally are. Right. This is the way and so they have a practice that's designed to allow that to happen. Yeah, you can compare it if, you know, you're not familiar with Dzogchen practice. You could compare it a little bit to, you know, Soto Zen, maybe. The idea of, concentrating on the openness of the field rather than on any particular object. Anyway, instead of picking, you know, the second or the third turning of the wheel as the best one, like Tsongkhapa says that the second turning of the wheel is definitive and the third turning of the wheel needs to be interpreted in light of that. Whereas the texts within the third turning wheel say the third turning of the wheel is definitive, and you have to interpret the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in light of that. So yeah, Dolpapa and the Jonangbas and some other people say that the third turning of the wheel is the correct one because it teaches that we're all fundamentally Buddhas, right? And you have to interpret all the business about emptiness in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in light of that it's a preliminary teaching, in the same way, say, that the Four Noble Truths are in the first turning of the wheel, that the most profound teaching is the fundamental reality of our always being Buddhas from the very beginning. So, there's this whole thing is related to the idea of sudden enlightenment versus gradual enlightenment. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2008 was teaching the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment by Tsongkhapa, when he came to the end of the text, he did this thing. He was in an arena with about 3,000 or 4,000 people, and he pointed up into the rafters over people's heads, and he said, "We're here, and Buddhahood is there, and so we have to start the process of the journey, of getting to someplace that we aren't." And so this is clearly a gradual, a quintessentially gradualist path. Lamrim, stage of the path. They're stages of the path. You have to go from one place to another. Right. This is what Mipham, is not part of that tradition fundamentally. Okay, so having been made co-host, I'm going to share my screen for a little while. Is there something in the chat I should see? Oh yeah, just the name of the text. Yeah, I really highly recommend that book because it's so well written. I don't agree with every single sentence in the book, by the way. I found a few things that maybe I'll talk to Douglas about when I see him. but generally, I agree with almost everything in it, and it really captures in an accessible way the distinctiveness of what Mipham's doing. Let's see, I have to make something a little smaller here so they can see what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, you can see this. This is my Kindle version of Douglas Duckworth's Janggon Mipham, His Life and Teachings. And, we looked at a little bit, the beginning introduction in chapter 1 before. We're skipping a few chapters, which I recommend, but we're skipping it. And going to the second section of the book where he's explaining basically Mipham's views. I've given a big overview of them, and this takes you into his text as he actually explains that. So the main theme, the central thread that runs through Mipham's work is the interplay of conceptual dualistic mind and non-conceptual non-dual wisdom. So in some sense, the point of this sentence and the point of the success of Mipham himself is that instead of saying, "Oh, conceptual thought is bullshit, you should all just stop thinking," right? He doesn't say that. He's read Tsongkhapa, he's read Dharmakirti, he understands Buddhist philosophy, and he knows its value, and he integrates it into his description of a path whereby one realizes that one's been a Buddha from the very beginning. Okay, yeah. So that's what he means by the interplay of the dualistic mind and the non-conceptual, non-dualistic wisdom. Yeah. So he also links this here in the next little sentence to the approaches of analytical traditions of study and contemplation, primarily referring to Gelugpa and Sakya. And on the other hand, meditative traditions of quintessential instructions, right? So the guru gives you tailored teachings, right? And the lineage of gurus gives you tailored teachings that I'll point out for you in some way, guide you towards seeing or knowing your fundamental innate perfection. I don't know if I told this story before, but in the there's many people in the Kagyapa tradition who hold a similar view. And there was one Kagyipa Lama who was getting ready to leave India and come over to America and teach. And he asked his guru, what am I going to tell the Americans? And his teacher said, tell them they are all Buddhas. Okay, so to me, I'm like, my first reaction to reading that is a little bit of shock and something like verging on horror, right? But that's what do you say? That's narrow-minded. That's a medicine that really helps and works for some people, right? It can be really healing, I think, for some people to be told at the most fundamental level from the very beginning, you are okay. You are basically okay. I think it was Shunryu Suzuki Roshi who said, you're all perfect just as you are. And you could use a little improvement. You can't coax people to change unless you affirm the idea that basically they're fundamentally okay. And some people really need to hear that as the first thing out of your mouth, right? So Douglas Duckworth says, the analytical path is a bottom-up approach to wisdom. It begins with the ordinary conceptual mind and uses concepts as a means to eventually transcend concepts. So it's nice that he recognizes that the Gelugpa is not just a conceptual tradition, that it's using concepts to transcend concepts, that the Gelugpa conception of what an awakened being is also one who has non-conceptual wisdom. On the other hand, a strictly meditative path can be called a top-down approach in that it jumps directly to wisdom's non-conceptual experience of reality. Now, Tsongkhapa is very clear in the great treatise on the stages of the path to awakening that this is simply not possible, right? This is contrary to what he believes can actually be done, right? But it's, intrinsic to the whole Nyingma tradition and to many parts of the Kagyipa tradition as well. Meditating according to the quintessential instructions received from a teacher, a guru, right? In this approach, Dzogchen, great perfection, a lot of analysis is not necessary because a fundamental feature of the great perfection is wisdom is already present within the nature of the mind. So all we really need to know is how to access it and let our true nature manifest itself, as I've been saying, right? Yeah, so this is the dialectic that he sets up and explains. On the next page, he says, the great perfection is on one side of the dialect, the framework of conceptually driven analyses and rational approaches to the truth, which definitely includes stuff in the Sakya tradition as well as Gelugpa. And the great perfection, the textual and meditative tradition that affirms that the nature of the mind is intrinsically Buddha, right? An important feature of the great perfection, the view, let me say that, the view of the great perfection is that it consistently evades systematic analysis. So this was a hard thing for me as an outsider to this tradition to get my head around. You're like, when I've tried to explain Koramba's view, right, to Venerable Thupten Chodron at Shervasti Abbey, it just didn't make sense to her, right? Because he believes that the reality that you realize, your ultimate mind, is the transcendence of all proliferation or all elaboration. And she's like, yeah, okay, so you transcend elaboration. What are you actually meditating? And it's like, no, you don't understand. This whole idea of trying to say that we're going to now define what the object is that you're meditating on, that is a conceptual elaboration. So yeah, I never convinced her that that was a way to look at things. But this is the same thing. He's not saying, I'm going to tell you this special thing that you're supposed to meditate on. He's saying, it can, the great perfection evades systematic analysis in its view. It is antithetical to abstract conceptual thought. Everything that you're thinking about what it might be is actually misleading you away from it. Then he says, to balance that, and because he's doing Mipham and not some other Nyingma mystic, he's saying the great perfection is not simply an anti-intellectual practice that rejects reason. Mipham supports his view with rational arguments, right? And he also emphasize the role of reasoned analysis and means to clear the way for the direct experience of the great perfection. So this was a revelation for me the first time I read in Tibetan a text by Mipham, which an excerpt from is in the back of this book. I called it The Sword of Manjushri, but I guess he has a different translation of the title of the text, but that's what it is. The Sword of Manjushri. What is the Sword of Manjushri? You know, in images of Manjushri, there's in Manjushri's right hand is a sword representing non-dualistic wisdom. And you know, associated with his left hand, emerging from his left hand, is a book representing, you know, conceptual dualistic dharma, right? So there's non-dual dharma and dual dharma in his two hands. The sword of Manjushri is non-dualistic wisdom. So when you know, I translated that text and I read it and I was like, I just thought it would be a bunch of mystical stuff about the great expanse and the Dharma Dhatu and stuff. And it's not that it's not that, but it also has all kinds of logic in it. And it's clear that A, he understands what Tsongkhapa is saying, and B, disagrees with it. And is able to explain that in a sort of, you know, whether you agree with him or not is different, but he has a rational argument, all right? And he's seeing these kinds of rational arguments as important, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And then he says, he has two models of the two truths. Actually, I did my dissertation in, you know, the 80s on the two truths. And as part of that, I got an interview in 1985 with His Holiness, the first time I ever met His Holiness, at his residence in Dharamsala. And I went there specifically to ask him questions from my research about the two truths. And, you know, he answered my questions. And then at the end, he asked me, you know, what I said, well, I'm trying to understand how the two truths are explained differently in the different monastic colleges and traditions within the Gelugpa tradition. And he said, well, what you really need to do is write a book that explains the two truths in all four of the major Dharma systems of Tibet, and also how it is differently explained in Tantra and Sutra. At which point my mind just reeled. And I was like, yeah, that would be good. And I'm like, yeah, there's no way I could do that, right? And I still haven't done it. But maybe I'm getting a little closer in doing this. I don't know. Yeah. So Mipham has two models of the two truths. Very interesting to me as a two truths person, right? He clearly outlines the two models and shows how the two truths should be understood in two distinct ways. So the first model, right, ultimate truth is emptiness, and the conventional truth he calls appearance. And we could call it also dependent arising. Yeah. In the second model, in his other model, he depicts the two truths as two modes of experience. So the two truths in the Gelugpa way, and what is Mipham's first model, are objects of knowledge. This is made very clear. What is it that the two truths are two types of? They're not two types of truths, right? They're not two perspectives. They're two types of objects of knowledge: emptiness and the phenomena that possess this quality of emptiness. These comprise the two types of objects of knowledge, right? So he's saying, yeah, that's one way to think about the two truths, but there's another model, right, in which we're talking about two different types of experience, two modes of experience, right? And then he goes on to explain here how in the first model, which, you know, maybe you're familiar with from the Gelugpa tradition, the two truths are always inseparable, and they're just conceptually distinguished. He uses the example of that there's two sides of the same coin. You know, everything you look at is right there is, you know, a conventional phenomena, and its emptiness absolutely inseparable. The emptiness isn't some other place in a different dimension. One Gelugpa teacher said, emptiness can't be considered sacred because it's the most common, ordinary thing. There's nowhere that it isn't. But the sacred thing, in the sense of being rare and precious, is a mind that knows emptiness. I thought that was an interesting insight. I haven't read that in a book. I just heard that from one. Well, I was going to say contemporary, but no doubt deceased now, Lama. So he explains more or less, as I would have, right, the two truths as they're understood by Tsongkhapa. The two truths. He likes to use the word unity, right? And say there's a unity of these two things, which they're mutually exclusive. Emptiness isn't actually the table, and the table isn't actually emptiness, but they're always exactly right there together. He says two sides of the same coin. And sometimes I've said two sides of the same coin, and then after people sort of get that, I say, yeah, but the coin has no thickness at all. So they're absolutely right there together. Yeah. So that Mipham explains that, right? And then he has this other model. So this would be like a second turning of the wheel, kind of approach, right? It comes down through Nagarjuna and to Tsongkhapa. And the other model of the two truths, Mipham represents the ultimate truth as authentic experience and relative truth as inauthentic experience. So fortunately for me, because I didn't know what he was meant by authentic experience, he puts the Tibetan authentic experience as his translation of Nenang Tung, which means that there's a concordance or harmony between the way things appear and the way they are. And that's what he means, authentic experience. So authentic experience is non-dualistically perceiving the fundamental nature of reality, I would say. He says, this is the ultimate. Perceptions that do not accord with this reality are relative. So it's like the second way of talking about the two truths, they're consciousnesses. And so that's, it derives from the third turning of the wheel lineage of focusing on consciousness and experience rather than objects. Yeah, in this latter model, the experience of meditative wisdom, which he calls unity, is the ultimate, right? So, if you think about, let's think about it and how this fits with Gelugpa. In Gelugpa, you're understanding what emptiness is, and then you're learning how to focus your mind on this emptiness you've understood. And then you're having a deeper and deeper levels of concentration and absorption on this emptiness that you've understood, until there's a point where you have a yogic direct perception of emptiness, and it's no longer mediated by a conceptual idea of what emptiness is, but a direct non-dualistic experience of emptiness. So yeah, what he's saying is that he says significantly, both the content of wisdom's vision and the wisdom itself are ultimate, not just the negation of distortion. So he's saying in Gelugpa, the emptiness is the negation of a distortion that doesn't actually exist at all. And there's this, intrinsic existence that we superimpose on things. And the sheer negation of that is the ultimate reality we meditate on. But he's saying, no, the ultimate reality is this non-dualistic wisdom that sees the world in concordance with the way it is, right? So the two truths in this later, experiential model, authentic and inauthentic, are not related in the same way the two truths are. In this one, clearly authentic experience supersedes and discredits inauthentic experience. And so he says, we see that the ultimate truth here is something positive, and the relative truth is something negative, and that they're two qualitatively different ways of experiencing. The ultimate truth in this context is not simply emptiness, the lack of true existence in things, because here the experiential presence of reality, known just as it is the ultimate. So, it's hard to not keep mapping this back onto Tsongkhapa's way of thinking. of course, there's an ultimate mind of non-dualistic wisdom that realizes the ultimate nature of things, and you can call that the ultimate mind, right? But what is the object of what is the object of that non-dualistic mind's meditation? Well, you can only talk about that when you're not in non-dualistic meditation. Tsongkhapa himself says in one of his texts that the idea that emptiness exists, the existence of emptiness, is something that's posited only from a conventional perspective. From an ultimate perspective, the perspective of non-dual realization, you can't, right? There's no idea of emptiness existing or not existing. But when you emerge from that meditation, you can reflect on it and realize, oh, yeah, I just realized emptiness. So that's the way Gelugpas talk about it. But it's not the way many other traditions in Tibet talk about it, because they feel that the idea that the ultimate reality is a sheer negation, a sheer absence of something that never existed in the first place is nihilistic, frankly, right? And that there has to be ultimately at the basis of things for people to have faith and hope in their teachers and their tradition. There has to be something fundamentally good and positive at the core of the tradition. And that's our basic Buddhahood, right? And so when you he's not going to say, like, I've actually been Douglas, I know Douglas Deckworth, and he of course mostly studied and only in the beginning of the book gives credit to Nyingma teachers. But he also has talked to good Gelugpa teachers, and I happened to be present during one of those conversations. And for him, it was a huge discovery to learn that what you realize on the path of seeing in non-dualistic direct realization, when you're attaining nirvana, the object that you're meditating on is emptiness, and that is the same emptiness, the same object that you were realizing conceptually earlier. This just doesn't make any sense from his point of view, because it's a totally different kind of experience. And they're representing things in terms of experience rather than focusing on the object. And there's a certain sense to that, in a sense, because when you're having this experience, you're not differentiating subject and object. That's the whole peculiarity of it, right? Is utterly non-dualistic, right? All right. So let's see, on this page, he says, the two models are not in conflict. They represent two different contexts or perspectives. One perspective, it was when the two truths, appearance and emptiness, are divided. And when does that appear to your mind? After your meditation. And then when there's no division between the two truths, and you're in unity in meditative equipoise. So that's how he's, corresponding his two models of truths is to the meditative equipoise and post-meditative equipoise experience. The division of authentic and inauthentic experience, that is, experiencing things as they are, ne, nang, tun, a harmony between how things are and how they appear. That's what he's calling authentic. The distinguish between authentic and inauthentic way of experience. The two truths are represented in traditions that affirm other emptiness. In other words, the Jonangpa and other Tibetan schools which exist today, there are many teachers, large sections of the Kagyapa tradition, for example, some teachers within the Nyingma tradition as well, clearly hold a view of other emptiness that I was explaining earlier, that the ultimate emptiness means that all of this is completely delusory in relation to the one true reality, which is our Buddhahood, right? And that's called the other emptiness view, right? And he says the two truths as appearance and emptiness is mainly associated with the view of self-emptiness. That is, that things are empty of their own essential nature, as that's the way we usually understand emptiness, right? Other emptiness refers to a phenomenon's lack of its emptiness with respect to something else, right? So let me just skip forward a little bit to this chart on page 73. So on the left, he maps out the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And then he shows, links the vehicles, the first wheel corresponding to the lesser vehicle, and the middle and the second and third wheels corresponding to Mahayana, right? And the Four Noble Truths in the first turning of the wheel. In the middle turning of the wheel, you have emptiness, the absence of true existence, right? And emptiness as a non-conceptual unity as well. And then the primary two truth model in the middle wheel is appearance and emptiness. And then in the third turning of the wheel is also part of the great vehicle. The focus, the distinctive teaching is on a mind basis of all, or the fundamental Buddha nature, or both. Sometimes these ideas seem to overlap in texts, sutras, and sometimes they don't. And yeah, the idea is that there's a fundamentally pure nature of the mind, right? And that's for some, at least, that's the definitive teaching, right? So he's relating that to this authentic, inauthentic experience model and the appearance versus emptiness model to the middle wheel of Dharma. So here he says, in contrast to the Gelugpa tradition on one hand and the Jonangpa tradition on the other hand, Mipham says that both the middle wheel and the Buddha nature sutras within the last turning of the wheel are of definitive meaning, that they're both teaching a definitive truth, right? And it's true, right, that Tsongkhapa says that only the second wheel is definitive, and the Jonangpa takes only a subset of the third turning wheel. The ones that we're calling the Buddha nature sutras are the ones that are definitive. So he's arguing that these are both definitive, and then that way he has to synthesize their teachings and show how they're talking about the same thing from different points of view. And that's essentially what the point of this book is. And then in this next section, he tries to argue that non-conceptual awareness of the ultimate, could lead to a problem, and that you see in the third turning of the wheel, and that is a reification of this. Like if you have a profound experience of non-dual experience of reality, and then you emerge out of it, you could think, oh, what I just experienced is the only thing that's really true, and that's my own Buddhahood. And all this that's appearing now, all this crappy stuff, is completely delusional, right? And then you reify the as absolute, this non-dual experience. And he's basically saying, yeah, that's what Jonangpa did. That's what Dolpa does. That's why, that kind of other emptiness falls to an extreme of eternalism, because it reifies this non-dual experience of reality, right? You can have attachment or a fixation on an experience of non-duality, and this could obstruct your realization, right? On the other hand, he thinks that you can emptiness. He thinks you can make the opposite mistake, right, and get caught up in rational analysis and think that the emptiness that you're realizing through rational analysis and deconstruction is the ultimate reality. And that's a tricky point, right? It is the emptiness that you realize through rational analysis and conceptual deconstruction. Is it exactly the same emptiness that a yogi realizes in attaining nirvana? So Tsongkhapa has many passages where he says, yes, it is. That's the whole point. You meditate on exactly that same thing that you have been studying and learning about, and you finally fully non-dualistically penetrate it. But the experience is completely different because it's not mediated by an idea or a concept or, say an abstract image, right, that you have of what emptiness is. It's like, yeah, the difference between understanding H2O and being in the water. It's like, these seem like two different kinds of things, It's hard to say, oh yeah, I knew water because I understand H2O really well. So that's the way they're looking. That's the way, the Mipham and Douglas Duckworth, I guess, frankly, look at this. It's not the same thing because it's the nature of the experience is so completely different that it's not meaningful to say that the object of that experience is the same, right? That's the way they look at it. Yeah. He says, the experiential dimension of the ultimate, an authentic experience, serves to correct the tendency to hold on to the emptiness of the two-truth model, right? I had a Gelugpa Lama, Geshe Gendon Lodrö, who lived in Germany and was sort of an expert on Shine, shamatha meditation, and some other things too. He's a great scholar. And he was talking to me the first time I really understood in Tibet what a Tibetan teacher was saying to me in Tibetan well, in an illuminating way. And he was telling me that when you get to a certain point that he was talking about, he said, then you don't need books anymore. Well, this guy was totally booked up. I mean, he was a classic Gelugpa scholar. He knew all the books, right? But he's talking about like, well, when you read, when you have yogic experience, you're not, when you know how to swim around in the water, right? You don't have to have somebody explain what water is to you anymore from a book. Yeah. So he's trying to say that each of these approaches kind of counterbalances the pitfalls of the other. And there is this thing within the Gelugpa tradition, if you look, right, where people would say, yeah, like trying to refute inherent existence of things. So I think maybe the fifth Dalai Lama has a text where he says, if you think that refuting the inherent existence is like, putting a hat on someone and then knocking it off, then you haven't really understood that the utter unfindability of things under analysis, right, opens up this spaciousness. It's not like there's this thing, inherent existence that, has been added on and then we subtract it off. That takes you in too much of a discursive direction. That's what the fifth Dalai Lama meant. Right. So he's trying to balance, you can see these polarities that said Duckworth is saying, a scholarly approach that emphasizes conceptual analysis and thereby avoids reification as absolute what's experienced in profound meditation. And on the other hand, a meditative approach that emphasizes non-conceptual experience, right? Which is what you ultimately want, is to have experience that transcends dualistic conceptuality, because you want to be more like a Buddha ultimately, right? Yeah. Both approaches taken on their own have a tendency to stray from the middle path into the extremes of nihilism. So he's claiming here, right, that Tsongkhapa is falling to the extreme of nihilism, right? Because he's claiming that the ultimate reality is a sheer negation, and that ultimate reality, a sheer negation, right? Nothing implied in place of the inherent existence that's been totally negated. That sheer negation is taken as the ultimate reality and the object of realization in yogic perception. This is taking from their point of view, right? From a Kagyapa point of view, as well as from Nyingma point of view, this is nihilistic because you're basically saying that ultimate reality is nothing. Of course, that's not at all what Tsongkhapa says, but that's how they understand this. And on the other hand, he's kind of, he's implying, as Mipham and in fact Koramba as well, say that the Jonang tradition of Dolpopa falls into essentialism because of, treating as an absolute that's not empty of intrinsic existence, but in fact is the real with the capital R, right? Is the Buddha nature that we have, and that's the only real, right? That's the opposite fault of eternalism, right? So then he goes back to talking about how these are related to two different types of people who lead different types of lives, hermits on the one hand and pundits on the other, and that these people have interesting conversations and encounters with one another. Yeah. Then he talks about four different models of conventional, four different models of reliable cognition, I guess we could call it. Just it sort of corresponds in a way to the four different ideas of the two sets of two truths. I mentioned one of these things last time. I alluded to it, that there's one way in which these things appear as inherently existent, and we realize that they're empty of inherent existence. But if you're a very advanced bodhisattva or a Buddha, it's not as though emptiness is the only thing that appears to you, right? There's the deities and the mandalas and the mantras of the Pure Lands. There's all these pure phenomena that appear, right? And Tsongkhapa, it seems, although he doesn't spend a lot of time on this in the text that I've read, but it seems that he would say, these things exist conventionally from the point of view of a mind that's been purified, whereas, these ordinary tables and chairs exist conventionally just as much as the Pure Land does, but they exist from the point of view of a mind that hasn't been purified, okay? So he's not going to say that the Pure Land is more real than this land. He's not going to say that this land is a delusion and that if you see it just as it is, it's actually a Pure Land. He's saying if your mind has become pure, then from that point of view, it already is a Pure Land, right? And you can practice adopting that point of view in Tantra, right? But you don't want to lose touch with this ordinary conventional reality as long as your mind is not purified. So that's the way Tsongkhapa would explain it. But in Mipham, it's more like the idea that, yeah, there is a more real way that conventional things exist, and that's the Pure Land, or the way that things, ordinary phenomena appear in a completely different way from the point of view, and that is more real than the way things appear now. It reminds me of a passage in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. If you read Bob Thurman's translation and introduction to that sutra, which is fantastic and I highly recommend, because it's the only Buddhist text I know, the only Buddhist sutra that's out and out hilarious and intended to be hilarious. But in that, Thurman talks about how this is a sutra, but it has a lot of Tantra-like qualities and features in it, which seems to be true. And one of those is that a Bodhisattva asks the Buddha, what's the difference between this right here, this impure world that we're living in, and a Pure Land? And the Buddha said, well, there's really no difference at all, and he pushes his toe on the ground or something, and then everybody sees everything as he's seeing it, which is like, oh, actually, this really is the Pure Land. and you're just not, you're not seeing it that way. So you see what I'm saying? They're both, it's in a way they're saying exactly the same thing, but they're sort of approaching it in a different way, right? Tsongkhapa doesn't want to devalue as less real the way that tables and chairs appear to us, right? It's just how things are from a certain point of view. Doesn't mean that everything exists only relative to a point of view, right? But for Mipham and many other people, no, like many Kagyapas, for example, it's clear that the way a Buddhist sees this as a Pure Land is more true and authentic and concordant with reality than the way we're seeing it right now. And that seems to be sort of the point of that passage in the Vimalakirti Sutra. Anyway, so I wanted to just hit one more little section here at the end of the next chapter. So towards the end of this next chapter, he talks about a supposed debate that took place in India between the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka and the Prasangika Madhyamaka point of view. And he says Nagarjuna, as Chandrakirti took the point of view, and Nagarjuna, his opponent, took the position of the Yogacara based on Sangha. And at the end of the debate, this saying emerged as a song. And I didn't know exactly where this came from, but one of my teachers told me this a long time ago. Nagarjuna's scriptures are medicine for some, but poison for others. The text of Maitreya and Sangha are, for all beings, simply nectar. Well, it's not saying that Nagarjuna's, teachings aren't true. It's just saying, yeah, they're poison for some. And it's true, if you look at the history of Buddhism in India as best we can understand it, the Prasangika view of Chandrakirti was never even close to the most popular approach. It's only after the 11th century in Tibet that it starts to becoming like the dominant philosophical understanding of what Nagarjuna said. I think most people don't realize that. If you go back historically in India, it was very marginal. And why? It's because it didn't seem to form a solid enough foundation for people's faith and practice. And the Yogacara school with mind only, and the idea that there's predispositions, our choices create predispositions in the fundamental mind, and then the appearances we see here are a single entity with our minds, and they're sprouting out of our past karmic actions. And this provided, what do you say, a more solid basis for people's faith, I guess you could say. And I think from Tsongkhapa's point of view, that's probably true. And that's probably why the Buddha taught it, even after he'd already taught the definitive second wheel, right? So I don't know if it's really true, in my opinion, that the texts of Asanga and Maitreya and the Yogacara or Chittamatra tradition deriving from those are nectar for everybody. I don't think this is my personal opinion, there's nothing that's nectar for everybody. There's nothing that's the perfect medicine for everybody, right? But it's clearly true that teaching emptiness as Nagarjuna understood it, and particularly as Chandrakirti interpreted it, can be poison for some people. And there's a prohibition among the tantric vows, not to teach emptiness to people who are not suitable to recipients of that, which of course is always a problem for me because, that's mainly what people ask me to talk about. Yeah. And let's just wrap up with this little section at the end of this chapter where he talks about Mipham's problems with Tsongkhapa. There actually are several, but we didn't explain the basis for all of them. So he says, by completely rejecting fundamental elements of Yogacara, Tsongkhapa forcefully argued that the consequent school, Prasangika, is a radically different view from Svatantrika, the autonomy school of Bhavaviveka. Mipham, on the other hand, emphasizes that these two schools are completely compatible. Yeah. And there are many other scholars in Tibetan Buddhism who disagree with Tsongkhapa's idea that Bhavaviveka and the other, Shantarakshita, for example, was in the Svatantrika tradition. They disagree with the idea that these people had a view that was inferior to Chandrakirti. They think of it as just like a different way of explaining things, or a different way of arguing for emptiness, inducing understanding of emptiness, but the emptiness they were understanding is exactly the same. This is a very subtle point, and I would say that one of the difficult things in studying Tsongkhapa is trying to understand exactly how, on what basis he reached the conclusion that, Bhavaviveka and the other Svatantrikas had a subtle reification that Chandrakirti had eliminated. And many, Western scholars who've tried to study this dispassionately have reached divergent conclusions on whether Tsongkhapa was successful. Personally, and you kind of know my biases for Tsongkhapa, but I eventually became convinced that he was right. But the evidence is pretty, I mean, it's not obvious. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Also, Mipham argues throughout his works against the Gelugpa tradition of the ultimate truth as solely an absence of true existence. Instead, Mipham presented the genuine ultimate truth as non-conceptual, authentic experience or something. Yeah. While provisionally useful, he repeatedly emphasized that the ultimate truth, understood as a mere absence, which is what Tsongkhapa says, is a product of conceptual analysis, and thus is still tied to a distorted conceptual structure. Right? And then he says, in the Gelugpa tradition, negations of phenomena are qualified such that their ultimate existence is negated, but their conventional existence is not. And Mipham, this doesn't comport with his way of understanding the two truths, right? Because he thinks the two truths are always right there together. It's a little hard for me to fully get my head around this, but you have to. Next time we'll look at some actual text instead of reading the rest of Duckworth, we'll try to look at a series of actual passages from Mipham, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But there's this famous passage where Mipham says that, that Gelugpa is wrong to say that emptiness is a pot's empty of inherent existence. Gelugpas don't want to say a pot is empty of pot, right? Because a pot conventionally exists, and so a pot is a pot. It's not devoid of pot, right? It's devoid of a reified kind of pot, which never existed in the first place. But Mipham says that, this is exactly how you're maintaining a sort of conceptual reification. It's his way of approaching the same internal criticism that the fifth Dalai Lama made, that you think you can subtract inherent existence from things and basically leave things unscathed themselves. He goes on, and this is the last thing I guess we'll look at tonight. He also claims, and this is shocking, right? Because I'm just totally used to the idea that Gelugpa has a self-emptiness view and criticizes the Jonangpa absolutist reification of another emptiness. No, Mipham says that Gelugpas have an other emptiness, right? Because he says the Gelugpa claim that phenomena are not empty of themselves, but are instead empty of inherent existence, that is a statement of other emptiness, because it's something being empty, not self-empty, but empty of something that isn't it, never was it, never could be it. And what that fits, his definition of an other emptiness. He says that this essentially leaves phenomena as they are, negating something else. What is it? Something else, this inherent existence, right? And that actually adds up to an other emptiness view. So that's a kind of strong and maybe I would say clever way of expressing the same problem that the fifth Dalai Lama recognized, within his own coaching of people meditating on emptiness, to not think that they were refuting, that the unfindability of things under analysis, right, isn't like, leaving things as we now take them to exist unscathed. It radically changes how we perceive reality. So I'll just end maybe with one example of how that's true. One time I was at the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center in Washington, New Jersey, with Geshe Tupke and Jay Garfield, and we were teaching about emptiness, and a bunch of people listened for a whole weekend. And then somebody said, okay, well, now I've understood this idea. And it's like, suppose, we subtract inherent existence from this table. What's actually changed? It's like, yeah, I see, the table's still there, just the same as it was before. And, and I said, well, we perceive the table as being made out of atoms. I mean, that's how we conceive of the table because of our, our materialism. We take the table as something that's built up out of atoms. But it's when you stop and reflect, you understand that's not the view. The view is everything exists as a mere imputation by thought. So atoms exist, but they exist as a mere imputation of thought, by thought. And the same is true of tables. If you think of things as atomically constituted, which is how, in the modern day, at least, we usually think of things. And in the old days, I think many people thought of it that way too, although they had a different idea of what an atom was, right? You don't have the understanding that all of these things are mere linguistic and conceptual designations, right? Yeah. Okay. That's a lot. I don't know how much of it you followed. But you're welcome to make any comments, observations, or questions. And then next Thursday, I'll be back and we'll look at the last part of this book, where he has a very nice anthology of carefully selected passages from Mipham himself. And we can look at the passage where he talks about, criticizing the idea that emptiness means something other than a pot being emptiness of itself. You say a pot's not empty of pot, then you're not really talking about, when Gelugpa say a pot's not empty of pot, it's empty of some other thing. He thinks that that's like, yeah, it's a cop-out, right? Yeah. Yeah. I don't actually personally think that it is. But that's a way of perceiving, way of understanding things that I'm trying to explain.
There's a question from Richard, and then I guess Alex has a question. David.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a very, very clear explanation. And I listened to the first talk, and it was equally clear, and very, very, very grateful to have, an opportunity to be introduced to Mipham this way. The question I have is about, it has to deal with his conception and the Nyingma conception of Buddha nature as in some way ultimate. It sounds to me like that's kind of saying there's some sort of intrinsic existence or inherent existence. And this sounds an awful lot like what I've been studying in another class, it sounds an awful lot like the Samkhya view, which is that there's something that we, that the sprout exists in the seed, and all we need to, and then one gets into Nagarjuna's refutation, right? What's the point of what's the point of arising if we're already have Buddha nature? Why study any of this?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious. I'm sure I misunderstand it, but
No.
at least that's how I understood,
Yeah.
explanation.
I don't think that you don't understand it. I mean, okay, so it's clever and interesting to make the connection to the Samkhya argument, and I think there is something to that. Some people, and that's would not just be Dolpopa and the Jonangas, but also many, but not all Kagyapas, would, I think, be vulnerable to that kind of criticism. That there is a kind of either eagerness to or willingness to slide into a eternalism or reification of our fundamental Buddhahood as being the real. And this is very explicit in Jonanga. If you read, you don't have to read, but just look at Jeffrey Hopkins' translation of a book called Mountain Dharma, which is one of the main books by Dolpopa, or just look at his summaries of what Dolpopa says in that. It's really phenomenal. He absolutely is an absolutist. It's very difficult to separate it. He doesn't even, Anyway, so it seems like monism. It's hard to avoid that conclusion. Anyway, but Mipham, and also I would say Koramba, and there's another whole group of non-Gelugpas who stick to the idea that nothing exists in and of itself. Now, sometimes they talk in ways that seem contradictory to that. And I, as an outsider, when I, go to Nepal, for example, and see people constantly talking about Rangjung Yeshe, and I know that Rangjung means self-arisen. And if something is self-arisen, then how can you talk about it like being merely conventionally existent, dependent, arising in the next breath, right? But so I can't fully explain this to you, but I will say that it is very clear that Mipham does not think that authentic experience is intrinsically existent. He thinks that he argues that there isn't anything that's intrinsically existent, right? Even authentic experience. Authentic experience, I mean, I want to say that authentic experience is like what Gelugpas understand as non-dualistic realization, that liberates you from all, begins to liberate you or eradicates some portion of, your beginningless afflictions. But what I left out of that sentence was it's a non-dual realization of emptiness, because he doesn't want to say that is, if you say that emptiness that you were meditating on and you had some idea about is the thing that you're realizing, then it's no longer an authentic experience, but it's distorted by conceptuality. But he doesn't think that anything exists in and of itself. So that makes me, I think if he were really an absolutist and thought that our Buddhahood was the only thing that existed and it existed in and of itself, I wouldn't have much interest. Personally, I would never have studied Dolpopa the way Jeffrey did. I'm interested because here's a guy who says everything's empty of inherent existence, but then he doesn't stop there, and he goes on to try to integrate his understanding of the great perfection while also maintaining that everything is empty. And also saying that, reason is like obviously true even in the Gelugpa tradition, concepts and reason is transcendent, or we have to use it to transcend it. Well, would Mipham say that? He actually does say that. He teaches logic you know, engages in debate, and he makes arguments for the highness of the great perfection view, right? So he's using reason to go beyond reason, and if you put it like that, it's not different from Gilligan.
Yeah, I imagine one has to like kind of dive pretty deeply into what Mipham is actually saying in order to understand how he jibes all of this with, you know, such what seems from the outside like a real, you know, assertion that Buddha nature is somehow or another there. And,
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm sure he's doing it in some sort of subtle way, but on the outside looking in, it just seems it's a little bit of a puzzle to me.
Yeah, because you're okay with the Sankhya model, you're thinking of Buddhahood as something in the future. The Sankhya model, you're saying like Buddhahood is in the future, right? And they're not saying that. That's the opposite of it.
Right.
Many, it's not an obscure view. Let me just say, when I first wrote the book Introduction to Emptiness, explaining Tsongkhapa's view of emptiness as clearly as I possibly could, based on the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. And there's a section in there where Tsongkhapa refutes other emptiness. He never mentions any person by name, but he has a pretty sharp criticism of it. And I came to the part of the book where I had to try to explain that, and I didn't explain it very well, and because I didn't understand it really, and I knew that Tsongkhapa hated it, but I couldn't make sense of it on its own terms, and you know, and I got some help from some other people on fixing that up. But the point that people, you know, what that and other experiences have brought home to me is that this is not just some deviation from the true Buddhism that fortunately the fifth Dalai Lama, you know, quashed, you know, it's half of the Tibetan Buddhist world today. It's the people in Naropa. It's people all over the United States, in every major city practicing Tibetan Buddhism hold this view. And in many ways, they're doing the exact same things we are. Okay. We'll look at his text next time. Maybe it will illuminate something. I don't know who, should I call on somebody? There's Abelardo, and David has his hand up. Okay. I'll call on Abelardo because he's to the left of David on my screen.
Yes, thank you, Guy. I'm enjoying your classes very much, and I've been studying a bit of Dzogchen lately, and so what you've been talking about today is very meaningful. And to me, what seems to be problematic is there are certain assumptions, like when one talks about Buddha nature and one's essence is Buddha nature, but it's more like a potential. It's very easy, and then you talk about the different kayas, you know, and Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakayas, and it's this kind of thinking. It seems to connote objects, you know, solid things. I find that's something similar also to the experience of collecting merit by you know, accumulating bodhicitta in different ways. It's like who's the entity who's accumulating merit, you know, and so it's very hard not to think conceptually. But what I think what Dzogchen is offering is a whole like a metaphysic. It's an ontology. It's about a dynamic reality that's created continuously, and that's one's own nature. And there's nothing really solid at all. Even as you're commenting modern science does not posit that the ultimate reality are particles or atoms. There are actually no atoms. Subquantically at the subquantum level, it's all just fields of energy informed, let's say.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this contradictions is when they say mind has no origin, and it has no end. That seems like a kind of eternalism to me. Why do we pretend it isn't, if that's the way we're thinking?
Yeah.
Is that true? Okay.
I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it's like, so mind. Okay, so the usual explanation would be that there's a continuum of moments of mind, right?
Yeah. Right.
Right, and that there's, yeah, and it's not like a single solid entity that exists from the beginning of time to the end. But yeah, it does become, if you're talking about that mind is the awakened mind of the Buddha, right? Then it becomes harder to understand what all the momentary change is that's going on within that. But yeah, I like the way you're talking, because it's the way people who've been studying and practicing the great perfection talk, which is not how I talk. But it's clear from the way you're talking that you have been engaging with this other way of experiencing things. Yeah, so it's good to bring the conversation. Yeah.
Well, it gives more meaning to life in any case, because you know, I try to experience emptiness in a traditional Galupa way, and it's just very boring. If you think you have a glimpse of it, well, it's very boring, right? Because what do you do with it? And whereas from the great perfection approach, I asked Lama, how do you actually experience? How do you know when you've reached you know, the Sogal, for example, and well, you become a better person. You're kinder and things like that. Well,
Right.
well, I already knew that, but you know, so there's nothing substantial there. It's exactly the same thing that one seeks in the Buddha nature approach, but without actually consciously think, oh, I'm becoming a Buddha. You know, once you do that, because what they're saying is we are. That's our true nature, but it's obscured by all our kleshas and so on. And so it's removing that, and then the true nature of the mind will shine. I find that, I like that. It seems simple.
Right. Well, that's what I was arguing at the beginning of the class today, that this is a kind of medicine that's super helpful for a lot of people. And it is absolutely a legitimate part of the Buddhist scriptural tradition. And a text which is translated into English that you can look at is the Uttara Tantra, or
Right.
So you know that text. It's Gyu
Yes.
Lama in Tibetan. I mean, this text explains, not in a sutra, but in a shastra way, you know, in great detail, how Buddha nature is, you know, our fundamental reality from the very beginning. And, you know, it talks about the Buddhist path in terms that are completely different from this idea that assumes that, you know, we have this little acorn within us that could grow into a Buddha if we have the right causes and conditions, but rather the idea that we have an innate kind of perfection from the very beginning. As far as that other comment that you said about the paradox of who's accumulating merit and so forth. I mean, that was reminding me of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, where it says, you know, the Bodhisattva proceeds along the path by way of not proceeding along the path, right? I mean, there's some times when, you know, what does that mean? Well, you can ask Tsongkhapa what it means, and he'll explain to you that not proceeding means that there's no grasping onto an inherent existent path or an inherent existent bodhisattva or inherently existent going, and that's why you can proceed along the path. Or you can not say all those words and just understand that sometimes paradoxes or apparent contradictions, you know, can be a useful way of pointing at reality. That's what my friend Jay Garfield says. I always resist it because I'm, you know, I want logic. But, you know, Jay's a professional philosopher, and he says, yeah, there's such thing as true contradictions. And that say that the ultimate nature of things is that there is no nature. That's a true contradiction. That's what he says.
Okay.
Okay, let's have Dave. No, let's see, Alex. I don't see David's. Okay,
I'm
Richard.
here.
Okay, David, there you are, David.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. I don't get it still, but that's my problem. But I have, early in the talk, you said something and I kind of missed it. An argument that goes like, well, it's this way during meditation, but when you, after meditation, you look back at it and it's that way. Could you repeat that very briefly? And
Right.
which side does that apply to? Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
so-
there's this notion of illusion like aftermath.
Right.
Is that related?
It's related, but that's not exactly what I was talking about.
Okay.
So when I talking about in Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa says that, okay, since direct non-dualistic realization of emptiness is, there's no sense of distinction between emptiness and the mind realizing emptiness. There, you can't, like Douglas uses the word unity, but it's like not even unity because there aren't two different things to unite. It's like, oh, the teachers say, it's like, yeah, if you pour some water into some water, it's like, yeah, mind is empty and it's realizing its nature and it's like, it's emptiness, knowing empty. So there's no concept or idea of anything, including emptiness. So therefore, the idea that things are empty or that emptiness exists has to occur after realization of emptiness, or you could say before realization as well. But the idea to posit based on direct experience that I have directly experienced emptiness and now I know that it exists by way of direct perception. That's something that doesn't happen when you're realizing it's something that happens post-meditatively. So that's the way. That's the way it's on.
Okay.
So Mipham has he actually he has the same picture in his mind in a sense, but he wants to describe it differently. He's saying that since what you're experiencing directly can't be conceptualized, we shouldn't call it emptiness as though it's the same thing that you were meditating on before, like this idea of the absence of inherent existence. That's what I was trying. I just made up this example on the fly, but I was trying to do it with the idea of just, this idea of water versus swimming in water and how different it is. Yeah. And so they're saying that the ultimate is what's the mind and its utter non-duality with this direct realization. And this is authentic experience. And he doesn't want to call it an authentic experience of this or that. You see what I'm saying? He doesn't say it's an exotic, because as soon as you form an idea about what the object is, right, then you're back in the level of reason discourse about whether that makes sense as the object. If the mind itself is the ultimate mind and it doesn't have any idea about emptiness, right, then you could almost, I'm just going to say, who are we? Who are we who don't have that experience and are standing outside it and say, oh yeah, that yogi was realizing something called emptiness. Well, when the yogi's realizing it, they have no such conception. They're just having an authentic experience. I guess that's all I got.
The reason I ask that is, according to Nagarjuna, time itself is empty. Before, after, beginning, end are all empty concepts. And if you start arguing on the basis of that, you're in very tricky territory.
It's true. Time is a hard thing to work with. Yeah.
And space too, parts, and so on.
Yeah. I alluded to this earlier. It was like idea that we think in our gradualist approach, we definitely think of our Buddhahood as something that potentially could happen in the future. Yeah. Maybe we reify or become, attached to the idea of a future Buddhahood. The idea that Buddhahood could be present, is disturbing. It's not the right, I would just say it's disturbing because it's not the right medicine for the right person at the right time. I find this metaphor of the medicine is like, yeah, it's the best way to deal with these differences, especially if it cashes out as the same thing, like, you know, people becoming kinder. This is what the Dalai Lama says. If you're doing a certain practice and you do it for a while, you know, by which he means a year or 2 or 3, and you haven't become a kinder person, then you should probably do some other practice. Now, Alex.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of thinking about the different medicines in the Buddhist pharmacy, and
Yeah.
you talked a lot, I think, about the importance in the Gelugpa tradition of the meditation on emptiness, or the ultimate reality, having to do with a kind of a mere absence or a non-affirming negation.
Exactly.
Kind of a thinking in that way. And
Yeah.
I wondered a little bit also in Gelugpa tradition, I think there's the topic of meditating on the clear light mind. And so I'm curious, can you reconcile kind of, what does that describe? Is that also a meditation on the ultimate nature, or is that kind of a relative nature of mind? It's a conventional mind. What does that describe? Is it the same thing, or is it different?
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, that comes from the tantric tradition. And so the Dalai Lama actually said, just maybe off as a kind of off to the side comment, maybe that's wrong. Anyway, he did say when he was teaching the Great Exposition in the Stage of the Path, that he thinks it's very difficult, just based on the sutra teachings, to fully understand how we can manifest all the qualities of the Buddha. And what he was getting at there is that he doesn't believe that there's anything that intrinsically exists, but he does think that the mind is fundamentally pure, and that by meditating on the fundamental purity of the mind and the clear light mind as the subtlest kind of mind, and meditating on the fact that this subtlest continuum of clear light mind has always been right together with its own emptiness primordially, right? That this is, you know, what he's presenting as the basis for talking about our actually attaining in the future qualities of an enlightened being. And it is interesting, you know, it's like, you know, Chandrakirti is taken as, you know, Prasangika interpretation of Nagarjuna. And a lot of people don't know this, and it doesn't seem to be ever mentioned in any place I've seen within the Gelugpa tradition. But if you read all the way through, you know, Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka Avatara, introduction to the practice of the middle way, maybe. In the end, he talks about a Buddha, what's going to come at the end of the path, and what a Buddha is like. And it's not like what most people or anybody in Gelugpa ever talks about. It's he imagines that, you know, mind, any kind of thing that we think of mind or consciousness now, is intrinsically dualistic, and that the ultimate fruit of the path is the Buddha activities that go on, you know, endlessly manifesting care for beings. But you can't talk about any inner landscape of the Buddha's mind that's deciding to do these things or perceiving things in this way or that way. And he actually makes it this idea of a, you know, you know, goodness radiating in all directions, but nobody home. He uses the example of a potter who's spinning a wheel and then leaves, and the wheel keeps spinning. I'm like, whoa. The first time you read that, you're just like, oh, I never heard about that in the Gelugpa tradition. Well, it's right there in Chandrakirti, and you're saying Chandrakirti is the authoritative interpreter. So the implication could be that, you know, if you start with the idea of emptiness as a sheer non-implicative negation, you might end up with a vision of Buddha that's not endowed with, you know, the kind of glorious powers and qualities and marks and characteristics that we're thinking of as what a Buddha is in the Mahayana Sutras. But we some of us, you know, jokingly call it the robo Buddha. You know, there's like a robot, you know, there's a function of compassion that goes on limitlessly, but it's impossible to describe what kind of consciousness could be behind it, because any kind of consciousness would be dualistic, and the Buddha's transcended that. So, you know, in order to avoid the robo-Buddha path, I think, first of all, in ordinary ordinary conversations, Gelugpa lamas interpolate a svatantrika, or sometimes yogacara explanation of what a Buddha is like. They take out of svatantrika texts that are not Chandrakirti, and, you know, describe what Buddha's mind is like on the basis of those texts. And of course, you know, I don't know if I didn't really make this clear, but, you know, in his fusion of Yogacara and Madhyamaka, Mipham, what's the tree? Well, I just forgot what I was talking about. Sorry. Oh yeah, so the clear light mind. Yeah. So anyway, this is what His Holiness said, is that, you know, when the basis of having confidence that we can attain Buddhahood as it's imagined in the Gelugpa tradition, it's certainly not reading Chandrakirti's texts. It's coming from, you know, tantric texts that talk about the mind of clear light and the emptiness of the mind of clear light, always being right there together from, you know, primordially. And that's the basis that he's thinking that, you know, Sangye, you know, that you Sangye means Buddha in Tibetan, and Sang means to purify, and Gye means to expand. So you have to have some basis to purify, and that's this pure light mind. Yeah. Clear light mind.
I'm thinking that you might be talking about sort of like a Buddha nature or Buddha potential.
Yeah, it is, because okay, so what is Buddha nature in Gelugpa? It's not that our basic nature is a fully awakened Buddha. That is what Dolpapa says. He says it super clearly. Like when he says, you are a Buddha right now, and you are fundamentally endowed with all of the qualities and marks and characteristics of a fully awakened Buddha, right? Of course, that's not what you know, the Gelugpa tradition means by Buddha nature. What the Gelugpa tradition means is that we have a mental continuum that is empty of an inherent existence. So the emptiness of the mind, the mind and the emptiness of the mind together constitutes our Buddha nature, because the mind is always changing and has the potential to be changed in any way that's possible to exist, right? Then it has the potential to be transformed into the mind of the Buddha. That's the idea. And that's what our Buddha nature is. It's our mind and the emptiness of our mind. And you can explain that just like that without even bringing in the clear light. But when you bring in the, the tantric ideas that you're talking about, the clear light mind and its emptiness from being, right together. Okay, somebody else, Erica. I don't see Erica, but I see something that says her hand is raised. Is Erica still here? Or did she raise her hand and go away?
No, I'm still here. Hi.
Hi.
I was having trouble unmuting. Thank you for what little I did hear. I don't
guess
even.
it's recorded. It's all recorded.
I'll have to backtrack and defy time. The future isn't what it used to be. So I came introduced to Buddhism through the Gelugpa tradition and was sort of rushed through a tantric path, which was kind of a big mistake. But in any case, in all the debate about the path to emptiness, understanding emptiness, the sort of inherent things are inherent of devoid of inherent existence, and emptying, hollow body meditation, and all these ways of dealing with viewing millions of people like viewing the same table. We're not all seeing the same table. It's our perception of that table, and it's a function of where you're sitting. But I like to keep things a little more real in terms of, well, for example, John Coltrane said that his experience of playing with Thelonious Monk was like stepping into an empty elevator shaft. And so for me, my sort of experiential path of working with emptiness now is about looking for those moments, oh, my wallet's gone, my identity is gone, and that place where the ground falls out from under me. And then I sort of ask myself the question, almost like, now what are you going to do? Sort of observing like my panic and what is it I'm holding on to, and so I'm looking at understanding emptiness that way, and my aging body, and from the standpoint of the Heart Sutra, as I'm having various diagnoses, and what am I holding on to? What am I trying to fix? And of course grief. And I really, the only book I've read of yours was A Buddhist Grief Observed, which is tremendous work. And I've bought it about 15 different times and given it as a present, and decided to work with that book with people who have going through terrible grief. Someone who husband was diagnosed with ALS, and befriending her, and kind of, it's horrific. And I knew, people run from death like rats from a ship in general. And I knew she was going to need a friend. So I did a little Buddhist experiment. And it turned out I liked this woman very much. And it made me a kinder person. And she was able to get through this horrific experience. So I wanted to tell you that directly. It was very practical, and it really helped. And I don't know if with my 6 nails of Tilopa meditation that I'm doing, and being in life in this way, looking for those liminal spaces, where the ground falls out, if that's sort of a good way to continue on the path for, dealing with this concept of emptiness.
I really like the way you explained it, and I think that is It is insightful and it's good. Like, okay, so what I talk about in Buddhist Grief Observed is that sometimes the ground can be pulled out from you in such a devastating way that it doesn't seem like a very helpful opportunity to realize anything, right? And although this is what Pema Chodron's book, right, and which has helped very many people, talks about, her devastating experience of being blindsided by her husband divorcing her. And
Yeah, with fall apart. Yes, fantastic.
yeah. And she repeatedly throughout that book talks about when your world falls apart, this is your greatest opportunity. And I mean, when I wrote that book, right, I was still in grieving, and I found her teaching to be very annoying because I didn't feel like it was a great opportunity at all. And I say that in the book. But of course, you're absolutely right. I feel like it's like the challenge has to be equal to the practitioner, right? So losing your wallet is one thing, losing your best friend is another thing. Do you know what I'm saying? Not being able to find where you left your pen. I'm losing my glasses all day. So how deeply you're identified or attached, as you say, to something has to do with how difficult it is to take it as an occasion and practice. I think it's the same thing in working with anger. Like, you're doing, if you want to explore what anger feels like in your body and you're practicing mindfulness, you don't want to start with the person who most infuriates you in the whole world. Right. And that's kind of what I was saying, I guess, in Buddhist Grief Observed, is like, hey, I have a certain level of skill as a practitioner, and it's not equal to this. But yeah, I'm glad that you got so much and shared with other people. I also have, and you would probably know this, I also have people who very much don't like that book and wish I hadn't written it. And I get many people who write to me and say, this really helped me in my time of grief. In fact, I got one last week like that. But I also get people who write and say, what the fuck? Are you a Buddhist or what? And they don't get it, right? And so it actually has led to certain good friends of mine feeling less comfortable inviting me to their Dharma centers because they're not sure what I'm going to say. Yeah, but my inspiration for that, in part was my own real experience mainly, but also, C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed. He's like a Christian apologist. He spends his whole life writing in different kinds of ways, justification of Christian dogma. And then when his life falls apart and the person he loves most in the world dies, he writes the first and maybe only real book that he writes. And he says, it's like, yeah, if you think that my faith is some great consolation in this time of loss, then you don't understand anything.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for writing it. And I'm glad to be on the seminar from whatever.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Yeah. Okay.
See you. Hope you'll see you next time. Okay, so more people have their hands up. I see Abelardo, and he already spoke. Is there someone else has their hand up who hasn't spoken, or no? Okay, now I don't see. Okay, if there's no one else who has
somebody named Dur. Is that what that says? Dur saying?
It's Dhruv, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Drew, okay.
Hi, no, I'm really happy to be here, by the way. I've rarely gotten to hear a discourse on emptiness in a more informal setting. Most of the time it's been bodhicitta, which is also great. But yeah, I think particularly right now I've been studying His Holiness's text, Searching for the Self, where he's also been describing the four tenets and how they all discuss emptiness. And that's why I actually signed up for this seminar, was because it was interesting to hear a later scholar after the Prasangika Madhyamika view trying to refute their presentation of emptiness. This is, you kind of realize the debate is endless.
You know, you're right. It's a mental exercise for me because, you know, I'm venturing off the territory that is my home and where I'm most comfortable, and trying to expand my understanding of the Buddhist world.
Yeah, and that's why like how this all ties in with the Buddha nature, and like because in these philosophical texts, Buddha nature does not come up as much. It's more about refuting inherent existence and
Exactly.
asserting something positive in its place is, it's kind of seen as weak. It's like you've
Well, yeah. Or misplaced. Yeah.
misplaced.
Incorrect.
Yeah, and I think in that vein, I'm trying to understand. I think from the description that you've given, like a deep I don't know if this is a conceptual thing or a definition thing of like when you talk about a potential versus an object, and the two kind of being like a potential not being solid enough to be called an object. I don't know if that is kind of the assertion here, because when you earlier were talking about the clear light mind, actually that was really helpful because I for the first time saw, oh, why Tantra is important. I kind of stayed away from Tantra because Venerable Children, who's one of my teachers, she says, stay away from that until you understood bodhicitta and emptiness to some level.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's great.
Yeah. But yeah, like I think it's kind of becoming clear to me right now from this discussion that that's maybe where Tantra is playing its role, is you kind of don't want to negate everything away to the point that you do not have, as you said, that you can't just believe you're a Buddha already, but at the same time, you need to believe that you can be a Buddha eventually. So I'm just curious, like, is it correct to understand that the Buddha nature being just a potential but not an inherently existing object is where the debate is arising from? Or just, yeah, like how do you understand that?
So the Buddha nature is a potential. And what is this potential? The potential, when you say, what do you mean by the potential? The potential is the fact that there's a mind and that the mind has no fixed nature. And therefore, the mind can and will change. And, you know, how it changes and how fast it changes and what direction it changes, right, depends on our choices, right? And so it has the potential to become anything that could possibly exist. So, you know, that's the idea, is that if the mind has the potential to become anything that possibly could exist, then the idea is that it could be transformed into a Buddha. And that's a Buddha mind. And that's what is meant in Gelugpa by the Buddha nature is Buddha nature is talked a lot about in the sutras of the third turning of the wheel. It's not talked a lot about in the sutras of the second turning of the wheel, right? Where you hear mostly about emptiness. Tsongkhapa takes the sutras of the second turning of the wheel, where there's a lot of the talk is about emptiness, as definitive. But he still has to say that the ones of the first and third turning are the word of Buddha. So he has to explain what they meant, even though he, right? And so you see what I'm saying? So, you know, when they say in the you know, Tathagata Garbha Sutra or something that, you know, everything is Buddha from the very beginning, then, you know, Tsongkhapa will say, well, this is the true teaching of the Buddha. And what the Buddha meant was that we have this mind, which is empty of inherent existence from the very beginning. You know what I'm saying? This isn't literally what the text says, but he takes it as like, well, that's how Buddha spoke about Buddha nature to be helpful to those people at that time.
I see. And if you were to summarize Mipham's kind of objection to that interpretation, I'm sorry I didn't fully follow along with the talk today, like I didn't completely get it, but like if you were to summarize it with his problem with Tsongkhapa interpreting that statement in that way, how would you say it?
Well, all of the whole Nyingma tradition and large portions of the Kagyu tradition hold that we're fundamentally Buddha already, and it's not a matter of becoming something that we're not. Do you know what I'm saying? That's the way they talk. It's a matter of manifesting who it is that we're fundamentally already are from the very beginning.
So are they claiming? So are they kind of in a Swatantrika Yogacara Madhyamika view at that point? If I'm understanding that correctly.
Well, I don't know if I explained that, but that actually is correct.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, he's very sympathetic to Shantarakshita, who, as I mentioned earlier, was, one of the first people who was invited to bring Buddhism to Tibet, and he was a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamika.
I see. And those schools arose.
Those schools arose.
I see.
And that's the Nyingma, means the old schools. They rose before Longdharma's persecution of Buddhism. So all the, the Nyingma was the Buddhists. It only becomes Nyingma when there's other Buddhists that later after Atisha. Yeah, in the 10th and 11th centuries. 11th century, really.
Wow, that's really helpful for contextualizing the other schools as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, all the other schools together are called Sarma, which means the new ones, as opposed to the old ones. Yeah. Okay. Okay, what do we have? Abelard. Is there anybody else? Well, let's go to Abelard. Abelardo.
Well, my only comment right now is I'm very concerned right now about the implications of all of these ways of thinking for what we're looking for, collectively in Buddhism. And there's a big divide between the Western secular approach to Buddhism and a traditional Tibetan Buddhist practices. And the big challenge, the world is becoming westernized. That's the big problem. And so, we live everybody's trying to thrive in a consumer competitive culture and in a dwindling planet. And this is ripe for all kinds of conflicts and distresses and so on, right? So to me, the big challenge is if you believe in emptiness in that way, and that you have to not get attached to anything, and you decide to live in a monastery, well, that's one way of practicing the Dharma. But for most Westerners, that doesn't make much sense, really. It's not attractive because we live in a hedonistic culture. We're accustomed to that. To me, the problem is really ultimately accepting life just as it is, accepting the impermanence of life. So would you agree that perhaps it's easy to make a confusion between impermanence, which to me is a fact of experience, and emptiness. One of my most recent experiences in that sense of impermanence was when my house got caught on fire at 2 a.m. in the morning. We had to evacuate and pray that the firemen would arrive on time. Only 1/3 of the house was destroyed, but that was a good experience of emptiness. There was something before, now it was empty, but but what was there before was real. It just wasn't permanent. So that is life. I mean, and so how can we, pretend reality is something different than what it actually is? Isn't that what Dharma is for? So we can live the best possible way in the reality just as it is, and transform it together, let's say, into a Buddhaverse, maybe. Yes.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, as far as your story reminds me of what Erica was saying earlier, is like, yeah, using the things slipping away from you as an occasion to realize the emptiness of things. But yeah, impermanence is, you can say that impermanence is a coarse type of emptiness because it's the emptiness of things having, you know, durability or continuity. But of course, it's not the profound emptiness, but it really, meditating on impermanence really does, it opens the door to understand the ungraspability of things, right? Because
Yeah.
things are constantly changing. And that's really important. And when you realize that people are constantly trying to grasp onto things, and it's in the nature of things to be ungraspable, and you see yourself doing it, and then you realize other people are doing it as well, right? Then it can engender a real sense of, I was going to say compassion, but what I really mean is solidarity. I mean,
Right.
we're all in this together, and some people don't know that they're in it, you know, and they just frantically run from one thing or another, you know, trying to comfort themselves without realizing that there isn't anything that they're going to be able to hold on to. It's all ungraspable. Yeah. Is that it? Did I answer all the questions?
Yes.
I think I did.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very good questions. Very good discussion. Next week, same time, 7, we're going to be looking at the third part of the book where there are different excerpts from Mipham's writings. And then the following week, 2 weeks from now, I'll also be here at 7 p.m. just to talk to anybody who shows up about anything they want to talk about. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Yeah, I enjoyed doing it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, everybody. See you all next week.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
All right.
All right.